The sitting president's longest-serving advisor is on trial for several felonies for allegations relating to how the president was elected. This is the legal finale that began with that dramatic 2018 arrest when Trump advisor Roger Stone became the last known Trump associate ever arrested in the Mueller probe. This now includes this case, a former Mueller prosecutor pushing evidence this week, arguing President Trump basically misled Bob Mueller, a potential crime. Obviously, this would normally be the top story in the nation, everything I just listed off, but these are not normal times. And thus, only now do we turn, in this broadcast, to the trial of Roger Stone. It started with a bang, allegations that Roger Stone talked to Donald Trump twice during the campaign, which is contrary to Trump's testimony to Mueller. And it continued today with prosecutors laying out evidence and texts designed to show that Stone tampered with a witness. The texts ranged from potential jokes to potential threats to references to the press and even The Beat. And the man Stone claimed as his back channel to WikiLeaks at one point, Randy Credico, took the stand, testifying under oath that he was not the back channel to WikiLeaks. If any of that sounds familiar, it may be because Credico made that claim right here on The Beat, one of several interviews we have done with Mueller witnesses. And we've heard from both potential back channels to WikiLeaks at this point, both Credico and Jerome Corsi. We've heard from other Mueller witnesses like Michael Caputo and Steve Bannon and Carter Page, Sam Nunberg. We hear from these individuals as fact witnesses. Mueller wanted to speak with them for what they saw, what they experienced, what they knew, and so do we. Which brings us to our exclusive guest tonight, making her first ever appearance on The Beat, Mueller witness Kristen Davis, a longtime associate and friend of Roger Stone, and remains in touch with him during this trial. In her Mueller testimony, she identified Stone's WikiLeaks intermediary as Randy Credico, and she is here for an exclusive interview, her first since the start of this trial. Thank you for coming on The Beat.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
I appreciate it. What do you see as important with your friend and ally, Roger Stone, a couple days into this, as the government makes the case that he lied to Congress, that he tampered with a witness, that he basically did a lot of lying about access to WikiLeaks in order to protect Donald Trump?
I think there's a lot of things to be concerned about. From the start of the investigation, which was led by Hillary Clinton's personal attorney, Roger wrote a book, The Clintons' War on Women. They've been at a political warfare for many years, so I think that was unfair, and she's probably not capable of conducting an investigation fairly. Secondarily, the judge has denied his line of defense of being able to argue that there was no corrupt intent for the obstruction of justice charge. I think it's important to note that the Mueller report itself identified three tenets of an obstruction of justice charge, the third being corrupt intent. And Roger was investigated and arrested by the Mueller team. And he's not being held to the same standards as identified by them. I think it's also important to note that he was asked 600 times about WikiLeaks, Assange, and after 600 times, I think, 5 times of error is a fairly reasonable percentage.
Your argument being you don't think he was maliciously intending to commit the crime and that the errors that he may have made weren't deliberate. And I understand that as a defense, so we want to hear your side. The contacts with Mr. Credico, which are admittedly baroque and involve pets, I want to put up on the screen because some of these were read in trial today. Stone saying in these texts, quote, "Stonewall it, plead the fifth, do the Godfather dodge, prepare to die," and then that he would, quote, "take that dog away from Mr. Credico." Do you believe that it is fair that the prosecutors are introducing those texts as evidence that Roger Stone wanted to intimidate Mr. Credico or harm him or his pet?
I don't believe that Roger Stone was trying to intimidate him. I think you're only seeing one side of those texts. The two of them have had a horribly abusive frenemy relationship for a couple of decades. Have
you been a personal witness to that?
I've been a personal witness. In 2010 at my gubernatorial campaign event, Randy Credico started heckling me and they got into a fist fight. I've taken phone calls from Randy high at 3 o'clock in the morning, screaming at me about Roger Stone. He's going to testify against him in some unknown investigation. I think at this point, from what we've seen, from Randy Credico today, it's pretty evident that he just pulled a very serious dirty trick on Roger Stone. He admitted on the stand that he accepted a message to pass along to Assange. So the whole time he's pretending to be a back channel and playing Roger and embellishing his role with Assange.
Let's dig into that. This is a very important point. It relates to the charges against Stone and also the public understanding of whether or not, as the Mueller team investigated, there really was some sort of nefarious plot to get inside intel from WikiLeaks. Mr. Credico spoke about that, you say, today in trial. We also asked him about that here because, as you know, one of the mistakes that Roger appears to have made was to publicly brag that he had a WikiLeaks back channel. He brought some of that on himself. This was what Randy told us about that when we pressed. Take a look. Do you ever carry messages from Julian Assange about what he might plan to do or the nature of his work to other people anywhere else in the world?
No, absolutely not. I totally deny. Was I the back channel? No, I was not the back channel.
He says he was not the back channel. Your defense on behalf of Roger Stone is that Randy Credico tricked Roger Stone?
Well, first off, my defense is I heard Randy Credico admit to it in my own apartment.
What did he say?
In 2017, he told myself and a film producer named David Lugo that he was the back channel. So, I mean, by his own accord, he was, in a time where it wasn't as heated as an environment, he was taking credit for it.
Do you have any records of that?
I mean, David Lugo's gone on the record. He's a potential witness in the case.
So you both attest to that, which again goes to whether, beyond a shadow of a doubt, reasonable doubt, whether Mr. Stone is going to face this jury or go to jail potentially. You're saying that at one point they agreed on this story, and that story itself wasn't true because he wasn't really a back channel of WikiLeaks.
Well, I don't know that they agreed to the story because I think Roger really thought he was talking to maybe, or at least trying to, contact him. There nothing ever came from that, but I think that Randy was embellishing his relationship with Assange. Also evident in this fake picture, this real picture outside of the Ecuadorian embassy. So you just did that and sent that to Stone to further this story that he's keeping? I mean, why would Roger have thought that was a serious picture?
Do you think that some of this trial relates to people bluffing and aggrandizing themselves into a story, and now the story has turned dark?
I think, you know, in Roger's defense, I think that you have to understand that he's a showman. He's an illusionist, and sometimes when you buy a ticket for the show, you don't necessarily think that the illusionist sawed a woman in half. You are happy with the show and the performance. And in the beginning, he said he had spoken to Assange, and then he quickly realized that that was an embellishment, and he needed to correct it.
So let me press you on that as the final point.
Changed.
You're saying something that we've reported here, which is you have to look at the entire context of Roger Stone's career as a dirty trickster to try to understand where he fits into all of this. But don't you think that he still had a legal obligation to end the show when he was speaking to the authorities in Congress, to not obstruct?
He did. He went there voluntarily. He wasn't subpoenaed. I think his state of mind was to clear his name. And I don't think, you know, if you've been tricked into saying that's correct or no after 600 questions, I don't think that's fair.
Understood. I really appreciate you making the time for us and appearing here on The Beat as part of this this week of the trial. And as I would wish everyone, I wish all of you the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen Davis. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.